Thank you all. First of all, if somebody wants to be able to see the slides, you probably better move up a little bit. But as he said, I'm Dave Fischer. I appreciate this opportunity to talk about my beloved ryegrass. My wife really appreciates it. When I told her I was going to be talking, she said, well, finally, you've got somebody who cares that's going to be listening. So we do have 750 acres contiguous that we own. We also rent about another 450 acres, so about 1,100 acres total that we manage. We have approximately 500 of the mama cows. We purchase an additional 200, 400 every year. In addition to that, we'll finish out about 650 cattle. And what I'll be talking most about today is our 200 acres of corn that we then manage it with annual ryegrass in the fall. So we have a double crop on that. We'll actually plant about 250 acres of annual ryegrass. Some of those, about 50 acres or so, usually is in sedan grass in the summer. But that's kind of what I've grown to really like, and it's really made a tremendous impact on our farm over the last 6 or 7 years we've been doing it. We do have about 4 full-time crew members and a couple part-time. As Brent said, we're about an hour, 15 minutes west of here. So real quickly, we do have 2 businesses at Fischer Farms. One is just the farm, the beef side. The other is the meat business. And on our meat business, we sell the beef that we raise off of our farm directly to restaurants. Each week we sell about 8,000 pounds of beef, 8,000 pounds of pork that we obtain from a neighbor who raises them naturally as well. About 1,000 pounds of turkey, 1,500 pounds of chicken, 700 dozen eggs, maple syrup, and about 30 cases of Amish vegetables, all from an Amish community. It's kind of like, well, we started developing this relationship with the chefs, and we just kept on adding on products to it. So we sell each week to about 100 restaurants and retail stores across Indiana. But that's all I'm going to talk about on the meat business. What I'm going to focus on is what others have deemed and said these are kind of your interesting farm practices, what we do. So the 6 different areas is ryegrass, winter grazing. And when I talk about ryegrass, it's always annual ryegrass. We don't plant any perennial ryegrass. So we do with the winter grazing. We then cut that for silage, usually about the first week in May. We then immediately no-till that back into corn, chop that for silage, and go back into that rotation. So that's kind of the main points I'm going to talk about, but also our winter feeding of silage. Last year we made 6 bales of hay on our farm. We're trying to totally eliminate making any hay. We're making it all into silage. And I'll show you with our feed huts how we feed out that silage. And the last thing, which was really interesting and just kind of got some more enthusiasm this fall, was on what ryegrass's impact to our soil health. So first of all, this makes a nice pretty picture, but it's the cows out on the ryegrass. So this was a cornfield, and again, we'll plant that in that late August time period, and then we're putting our cows and our fall calving cows in particular out on that ryegrass. We calve twice a year, September, October, and then also in March, April. So this is a little bit more detail of how we get that ryegrass going for winter grazing. So we'll plant it, and you'll see the first picture there. We plant that, like I said, as soon as we can get it in the ground. I mean, if we could plant it August 15th, I would. Probably not any earlier than that, just because of the fear of it being dry in September. But best August 20th, September 15th, in that time period. And we've kind of centered on about 22 pounds an acre of ryegrass. We start grazing on that about 45 days of warm weather after it's planted. Warm, and it's got some moisture. Previous year, we had it where all of September was dry, and some of the ryegrass actually died out, not very much of it, but some did, and you just got to wait a little bit longer than to graze that. This last year was a great growing year, just continuing to have the rains and nice warm fall. So we graze only when the fields are dry or the ground is frozen. That was really a hard rule for us a couple years ago. I'm going away from that to where now I'm letting the cows out there. Like right now, of the 200 acres, we probably have about 160 or so that have cows on them right now. And a lot of that is just to spread kind of the cows out in the winter months so they're not as packed in together for their health. Okay. So one thing I love about ryegrass, and this is the part my wife really gets tired about, in January when you got a day where it's 55 degrees, I love driving around on the farm, walking out in the fields and talking about how my ryegrass is growing. Because it is growing. When you get those nice warm days in January and February, you get growth, you get cows out there, and we'll try to hold them back, but then let them off at a certain time and get some great grazing going on. Like I said, it'll be 2 feet tall in November if you plant it in that late August time period. One thing I have noticed, I was talking to some producers about it today, is you really do need to get that grazed down during the winter months. If you let it even 8 to 10 inches tall, and then you get the cold spells like we've had the last couple of weeks, that will actually freeze and kind of crust over and really smother the growth out. Now you can graze it after it's dried out like that, but you've got to get that off before March. I've had it before where if you don't, it just smothers out that ryegrass and you're not going to get much regrowth. So that's kind of the winter grazing, but then what we do is about middle of March to early April, we'll take our cows off the ryegrass, we'll put them out on the fescue fields, and then we'll start chopping it for silage. So it was about 5 years ago that we switched to self-propelled choppers, and I said, well, if I got this equipment, it makes so much better quality feed, why don't I do that instead of making the baleage? We'd been making baleage for about 10 years. And as I'll talk later, it's a really, I think, a lot better quality feed. Here we are. We pack it all in a trench silo, and we divide up the trench silo with those movable blocks to kind of figuring out so we can get it. Ideally, I want it as tall as possible. Those walls are about 12 feet tall on the outside. Obviously, just trying to reduce the amount of spoilage we got. One interesting thing, I had another silage pit that was kind of out of the way, and it was sitting there for 3 years, and I've always kind of used it as a backup feed. Well, I decided this year I needed to go ahead and use it. We rolled that silage, or that plastic off, and it had some holes in it from some calves that had gotten out and been walking on it previous years. But after 3 years, we still only had about 6-8 inches of rotten stuff on top. It's really good quality yet. So after we harvest off that silage, we then go back and no-till corn, and we plant that right into it. We're shooting for about mid-May. And you can see the picture on the right. That's kind of the ideal setup where we've got that ryegrass. You've got to cut it off, and that's kind of my caution note over there. We've tried it before where we let the cows graze, and you'll have some spots in the field that are 6 or 8 inches tall that the cows didn't get to. You try to spray that down. It'll die, but it might take 2 or 3 weeks to die, and while it's doing that, it's competing with the corn. And so what we found that has really worked well for us, and I know a lot of people are afraid of the annual ryegrass just because it's so vigorous and so hard to kill. We've had no problems killing it if we go this route, where if we chop it or cut it for hay or chop it for silage, cut it, wait about 2 or 3 days after cutting it, you get just a little bit of leaf back on it, and then spray with Roundup, and we have no problems getting it killed, and it'll be killed in 4 or 5 days. Here, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we've really been happy with the corn yields that we've been able to get from it, and I think this is large due to the ryegrass and the roots that have really added organic matter and broken up our fragipan. So our winter feeding, silage versus hay, again, the feed value of silage is really what pushed me away from hay into silage. I just feel like we get such a more consistent quality, plus just overall better quality. We did some sampling. We had 13% protein on our ryegrass silage. It was really good hay, or good feed. Ease of winter feeding. My guys love feeding like this instead of with round bales, dealing with net wrap and so forth. And our flexibility to add byproducts like wet gluten. This last few weeks when it was cold, I happened to get some cheap wet gluten feed. We added that into the silage mix, got a lot more energy in the rumen to help them deal with the cold weather. Obviously reducing waste when you're feeding like that versus feeding in hay rings. The manure management is simpler. Cattle management, I'll talk a little bit about that with these feed huts. So now we've got about 4 sets of these feed huts. Each one of them is about 128 feet long, 16 feet wide for each side of the hut, with a road going down the middle. And there's kind of a top-down design view, if you will. You'll see the 2 feed huts there in yellow. And then what we did is we add an alleyway and we move our portable squeeze chute around so we can work cattle at any one of these sets of feed huts. So it really works as 3 different pens, each of the feed huts being one, and then the road in the middle, we can put gates on there and manage the cattle with that. It really helps, like with the AI and so forth, we can keep kind of the cattle where they're at, where they're being fed at. So the last thing I really want to talk about, and probably one of the most important, is what ryegrass has done for our soil health, right? So this was just this last fall, October 17th took this picture, and that's the day Dr. Lloyd Murdoch came up from the University of Kentucky. And as I said, I switched from wheat to ryegrass about 6 years ago. And one of the reasons we switched was just the flexibility the ryegrass gave us in the springtime. Wheat, you have a very narrow window when you have to harvest it and have good quality, otherwise it gets too stemmy and those kind of issues. Ryegrass is much more forgiving. But I also had heard that ryegrass goes deep with the roots, it'll go 18 inches deep and so forth, and it really help break up your ground. You know, and I really didn't think too much more of that. But Dr. Murdoch came up and we did some testing, and he found that, you know, when we measured, the top of the plant was 24 inches tall, and again, this is 47 days after we planted it. The roots were already over 27 inches deep. And what he explained to me was the roots are not just physically breaking up the fragipan, they're actually releasing a chemical. And he'll tell you all the detail. I'm not going to steal his thunder for his research. But what he's explained to me is there's actually chemicals that the ryegrass roots release that break up the fragipan. And he estimated that we had turned about 14 inches of fragipan into subsoil over the course of those 6 years. And the research he's shown is 1 year doesn't do it. 2 years, you start seeing a little bit of impact. When you get in that 3rd and 4th year, you start seeing major impact. So I feel like what he suggested was the ryegrass would really add about, by adding that fragipan, it would add about 2 weeks of drought tolerance in the summer because you've got so much more subsoil to hold that water. And I've seen that with our corn crops, comparing it to neighbor corn crops. It seems like ours is more drought tolerant. Okay? And this kind of explains the reason why to me. The other part, you know, obviously that chemical part, but the roots that are left behind by the ryegrass. So, you know, if you think of it, you know, you can see those plants 24 inches tall or taller. When we go in and graze those, our cows are going to graze those down over the matter of about 3 or 4 weeks. And then when they do that, all those roots are left behind, right, to decay into organic matter. So when we do that again in the spring, in May when we're cutting that for silage, same thing happens. We're leaving all those roots behind to break down into organic matter. So I feel like we've really increased the value of our soil or the quality of our soil with the ryegrass in doing this. One interesting thing was the probe on the side of his truck. When he went into a very similar field that hadn't been managed that way, had been managed in perpetual fescue, he put that prod down and it wanted to lift up the side of the truck. When he goes over about 100 feet into the ryegrass, same soil types, just been managed different over the last 10 years. You put the probe down, it just went smooth down just like butter till it went about 30-some inches before it hit that fragipan, and then it puts a little strain on it. So my last slide, I think I've got a couple minutes here yet, is talk about what we're actually getting off of those fields. And again, this is probably the biggest impact on our beef business, on the number of cattle that we can produce, the number of calves go out our door, the amount of feed that we can create on our farm, is having this ryegrass and corn silage rotation. The pasture ryegrass, I'm guessing we're getting about 2 to 4 tons per acre. And again, this is in wet matter, not dry matter tons. We then come back and chop the ryegrass for silage. We'll get another 3 to 6 tons in May. Add that to the corn silage and the yields that we're getting, 24 to 30 tons. On those acres, we're getting 26 to 36 tons of feed off of each acre for 200 acres. A tremendous amount of feed that we're able to harvest off of those. Plus, we're still utilizing them for grazing for 6 months out of the year. You know, the cattle are still utilizing that ground. So we put a lot back to our soils, a lot through the manure, We bed our finishing barns with sawdust, so a lot of that goes back onto these fields. And then we also put potash. We'll put about 700 pounds, a little bit more than that, per acre to help replenish that soil, that obviously being the main thing we're pulling off. The other thing I will say is ryegrass does need the nitrogen. It'll use about 50 pounds in September and about 100 pounds in March to get good growth. The nice thing is if you don't quite have the corn crop you'd hope for and you're not using all the nitrogen from the corn crop, you'll get use of that right away with the ryegrass in the fall. So I'll end it there and ask for any questions. Another beautiful picture of my ryegrass.
Any questions for Dave? Yes.
Are your yields just raw matter basis or as
As
fed basis?
fed.
Do you have any issues with your distribution with your feed areas? Are they trying to deposit a lot of manure in your feed areas, or are they out in the pasture?
It would be more, I'd say, but the nice thing is when I always say where they eat is where they shit. And so they're right there in the feed huts. And like I said, this time of year, especially when it's cold, we'll go through about every 2 weeks with a skid loader. And usually we'll get about 1 manure spreader per feed hut, and we can easily spread that around. It's a lot easier than with the hay bales, dealing with that.
Any other?
All right, thank you.